Martha Whitmore slammed both hands on that kitchen table so hard the tin cups rattled, and the youngest ranch hand knocked his chair backward, trying to get away from her. "You want to throw this away?" she demanded, lifting a heap of bones and wilted greens that smelled like 3 days of neglect. "You want to throw this away?" Nobody answered. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned back to the stove, lit the fire with shaking hands, and started cooking. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you are exactly who this was made for. Please subscribe to this channel right now, hit that subscribe button, and turn on notifications so you never miss a single chapter. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. Because what Martha Whitmore did in that kitchen in the summer of 1885 is going to stay with you for a long, long time. Martha Whitmore slammed both hands on that kitchen table so hard the tin cups rattled, and the youngest ranch hand knocked his chair backward, trying to get away from her. "You want to throw this away?" she demanded, holding up a fistful of bones stripped nearly clean, and a cluster of vegetables so wilted they had started curling back on themselves like something ashamed of still existing. "You want to throw this away?" The boy, Sam Miller, 17 years old and new enough to the ranch that he still looked surprised every morning when the sun came up over the same flat Wyoming horizon, stared at her with his mouth hanging open. "Ma'am, that stuff ain't fit for the dogs." Martha set the bones down on the cutting board with a sound like a gavel. "Boy," she said quietly, "you don't know the first thing about what's fit." She turned her back on him and got to work. That was the 14th of June, 1885. Martha had been at Broken Willow Ranch for exactly 4 hours. She had arrived that morning in the back of a supply wagon driven by a man named Gerald Potts, who had said less than 11 words to her the entire 2-hour ride from Casper. She hadn't minded the silence. She was used to it. People tended to go quiet around Martha Whitmore, not because she frightened them, not exactly, though she was a large woman, full-figured and solid in a way that made some men step aside when she walked down a boardwalk. People went quiet around her because they were busy thinking things they didn't have the nerve to say out loud. She had heard the whispers in town before she even climbed into Gerald's wagon. "That's the one Elias Carter hired. Lord help him. She ain't gonna last a week out there. She ain't gonna last till Wednesday." Martha had kept her eyes forward and her chin level, and had walked past every single one of them without breaking stride. She was 27 years old, and she had been hearing that kind of talk since she was 9. It didn't cut the way it used to. Or maybe it still cut just as deep, and she had simply learned how to bleed quietly. She weighed close to 320 pounds. She knew what people saw when they looked at her. She had stopped waiting for them to look past it. What she carried onto that wagon was one battered leather suitcase, a cast-iron skillet wrapped in an old flour sack, and a recipe book so worn and reread that the cover had separated from the spine and been reattached with a piece of rawhide lacing. That book had belonged to her grandmother. Her grandmother had fed 20 people 3 times a day on a sharecropper's plot in Tennessee with less food than most people used to cook for 5. Martha had learned everything she knew from that woman, and that woman had taught her the most important lesson before Martha was old enough to read the recipes herself. Nothing is useless unless you decide it is. Broken Willow Ranch looked like something that had decided it was useless a long time ago. The fence posts along the main approach leaned at angles that suggested they were only still standing out of habit. The barn door hung open on one hinge and had clearly hung that way long enough that no one remembered it being any different. The yard between the barn and the house was not quite mud and not quite dust, but some unhappy combination of both rutted deep with wagon tracks that had dried into hard ridges. 2 chickens wandered through it, looking purposeless. A dog sleeping against the side of the house raised its head when the wagon pulled up, looked at Martha for a long moment, and put its head back down. The house itself was 2 stories wood-framed and had probably been handsome once. You could still see the bones of it, the wide covered porch, the large front window, the solid stone chimney. But the porch railing had been patched with mismatched boards. The window had a crack running through one corner, held together with a strip of cloth, and the chimney had a gap in the mortar near the top that someone had stuffed with what appeared to be an old work glove. Martha climbed down from the wagon without waiting for Gerald to offer a hand. She had learned not to wait for things that weren't coming and stood in the yard looking at the house. She was not discouraged. She had seen worse. What she felt standing there in that dusty Wyoming yard with her suitcase in one hand and her skillet under her other arm was something closer to recognition. This place looked the way she had felt for most of her life, like it had been worn down by time and neglect and the steady accumulation of small losses until it had almost forgotten what it was supposed to be. She understood that feeling very well. The front door opened before she reached the porch steps. Elias Carter was 38 years old and looked 50. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had done serious work for serious years. But there was something collapsed about him, something that had given way behind the eyes. He was wearing a shirt that had been washed so many times it had faded to a color that had no real name. He stood in the doorway and looked at Martha the way a man looks at a problem he doesn't know how to solve. "You're the cook," he said. It was not a question. "I am," Martha said. "Harriet Bloom at the agency said you were experienced." "I am." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved slightly like he was chewing on something he'd decided not to spit out. Then he stepped aside and let her in. "Kitchen's at the back," he said. "Supper's supposed to be at 6. It ain't been 6 around here in a while." Martha walked past him into the front hall and turned toward the back of the house without being shown. She could find a kitchen. She could always find a kitchen. What she found at Broken Willow was a room that smelled like old grease and disappointment. The stove was a good one, a large wood-burning range that could have fed an army if someone had bothered to keep it properly. The floor had been swept at some point in the recent past, but not recently enough. The work table was scarred with years of use, and the shelves were what stopped her. She stood in front of them for a full minute. There were bones. A pile of them in a crockery bowl stripped and dry, the kind that usually went to the dogs or the compost heap. There was a cloth sack of dried beans that had been there long enough that some of them had shriveled. There was a small barrel of cornmeal that had been opened and resealed badly, so the top layer had gone stale and hard. On the bottom shelf sat a jumble of vegetables in a state somewhere between fresh and gone carrots, gone soft onions, with the outer layers blackening a half-dozen potatoes with eyes so long they looked like they were reaching for something, and a bunch of herbs so dry they crumbled when she touched them. In the corner under a piece of cloth she found a cured ham bone with a little meat still clinging to it, and a jar of bacon fat someone had been saving. She stood there looking at all of it. Then she rolled up her sleeves. She had the fire going in the stove in under 4 minutes. She had learned from her grandmother that the fire was always first, that everything else waited on the fire. While the stove heated, she sorted through the vegetables, setting aside what could be saved and what couldn't, with the quick, decisive movements of someone who had done this 10,000 times. The outer layers of the onions went. The softest parts of the carrots went. What remained was less than she would have liked and more than enough. She put the bones in her largest pot, the one she had brought herself, because she had known better than to trust someone else's kitchen, covered them with water and set them to simmer. The smell that began rising from that pot within 20 minutes was the smell of something being recovered, something being pulled back from the edge. Sam Miller came into the kitchen at 5:30 looking for crackers. "Ain't no crackers," he said like he was accusing her of hiding them. "There's supper in an hour," Martha said without turning around. "What kind of supper?" "The kind that's hot and made from scratch." He looked at the stove. He looked at the pot. He wrinkled his nose at the pile of discarded vegetable scraps on the work table, the parts she'd cut away, and that was when he made his mistake. He reached for the bones still sitting in the bowl beside the pot, the ones she'd already used to start her stock, and said, "Why ain't you thrown this mess out already?" And Martha turned around and put both hands on that table, and the tin cups rattled, and Sam Miller knocked his chair backward, and she said, "You want to throw this away?" He said it wasn't fit for dogs. She told him he didn't know the first thing about what was fit. Then she sent him to the barn to tell the other men that supper would be served at 6 o'clock sharp and that anyone who was late would find sympathy. He went. She could tell by the look on his face when he left that he didn't believe there would be any supper worth arriving for. That was all right. She had been underestimated her entire life. She had learned to use it. By 5:55, the kitchen smelled like something a person could believe in. The bone broth had been strained and returned to the pot. The beans soaked in water so hot it made them surrender their staleness within the hour had gone in with the broth, along with the salvaged carrots. Onions and potatoes cut fine enough that their imperfections disappeared into the whole. The ham bone had gone in last, and the little remaining meat had fallen from it in shreds that turned the broth into something close to a proper stew. She had taken the cornmeal, scraping the stale top layer off and working with what was sound underneath, and made a pan of cornbread in her skillet, flat and dense and fragrant with the bacon fat she'd used to grease the pan. It was not a fancy meal. Martha had never made fancy meals. She made real ones. At 6 o'clock, she carried the pot to the long wooden table in the dining room and set it down. The men came in one at a time. There were 7 of them. She had not met any of them properly yet, but she catalogued them the way she always did, quickly without appearing to look too hard. Sam Miller, the youngest, who had already decided she was a disaster. Walter Brooks, older, gray at the temples, who came in with his hat already off and his head slightly bowed in the automatic courtesy of a man raised to mind his manners, regardless of circumstance. Henry Davis, somewhere in his 40s, with a stillness about him that suggested either deep calm or deep damage. She wasn't sure yet which. 3 others whose names she would learn later. Cord Pete, and a man everyone called Dutch, who had a scar running from his left eyebrow to his jaw and eyes that assessed everything and gave away nothing. And Elias Carter, who came in last. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the table, looking at the pot, looking at the pan of cornbread she'd laid beside it on a cloth. His face didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes that Martha caught and catalogued just as quickly as everything else. He was surprised. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anything. Nobody sat until he did. He took the chair at the head of the table, the chair of a man who had once known clearly what he was the head of, and then the others sat, and then Martha ladled out the stew, and they ate. The first man to speak was Walter Brooks. He looked up from his bowl after 3 bites and said quietly, almost to himself, "I'll be." "Something wrong?" Sam asked, clearly expecting confirmation of his own low expectations. "Something wrong?" Walter repeated like the words didn't make sense to him. "No, boy. Something right." Henry Davis ate without speaking, but Martha noticed that he finished his bowl before anyone else, and then sat very still for a moment, before asking in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used for conversation in a long time, whether there was more. There was. Elias Carter ate slowly. He didn't finish his bowl quickly like Henry. He didn't make sounds of appreciation like Walter eventually did, or ask halting questions like Sam. He ate slowly, like he was trying to figure something out. Like the stew was telling him something he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Martha stood at the stove and watched them all without appearing to watch any one of them. And she felt the thing she always felt when a meal she had made landed right, that deep, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with purpose. She had fed people, real food, real nourishment, from things everyone had decided weren't worth keeping. After the meal, after the men had gone, and the table had been cleared, Elias Carter came back to the kitchen doorway. Martha was washing the pot. She heard him come in, and she kept working. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" he asked. "My grandmother," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What did she teach you?" Martha set the pot down and turned to face him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Not aggressive, just contained. Like a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible in his own house. "She taught me that nothing is worthless," Martha said. "Most people just stop looking before they figure that out." He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, not agreement exactly, more like acknowledgement, and turned and walked back down the hall. Martha turned back to the sink. Outside, the Wyoming sky had gone the color of old copper, and the first stars were coming up over the flat horizon, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses made a low sound, like a question being asked of no one in particular. Martha dried her hands on her apron and looked out the window at the darkening yard. She had nowhere else to be. She had nowhere else that wanted her. So she started planning breakfast. That was how it began. Not with fanfare, not with anyone deciding that Martha Whitmore mattered, but with a pot of stew made from bones and cast-off vegetables, and the deep, stubborn knowledge that nothing worth having is ever truly past saving. The next morning, she was up before the sun, which meant she was up before everyone, which meant she was the first to hear the voices. She had the fire going and the coffee on, and was cutting salt pork into the skillet when she heard two men talking just outside the kitchen window. She didn't stop cutting. She had learned a long time ago that stillness attracted attention, and that the best way to hear things people would stop saying if they knew you were listening was to keep moving and keep quiet. "Told you she ain't gonna work out," said a voice she placed as chords. "Woman that size can't handle a real day's work. She'll be gone by end of the week." "She cooked that stew," said the other voice. "Pete. Anybody can throw bones in a pot. You eat 3 bowls of it." A pause. "That ain't the point. The point is Carter don't need another thing failing on this place. Bringing her out here was I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he was thinking we ain't eaten a proper meal in 3 weeks. Another pause longer. "Yeah, well." They moved away from the window. Martha listened to their boots in the dirt until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she cracked 6 eggs into the skillet alongside the salt pork and didn't think about it again. She had heard worse. She would hear worse again. And she had learned something in 27 years of being the woman people expected to fail. The expectation itself was a kind of fuel, if you knew how to burn it right. Elias Carter came into the kitchen at 5:30, looking like a man who hadn't slept, but had stopped minding that a long time ago. He stopped when he smelled the coffee. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," Martha said. "How do you take it?" He blinked like the question surprised him. "Black." She poured him a cup and set it on the table without ceremony. He sat down like he wasn't sure he was supposed to like sitting in his own kitchen at his own table was something that required permission he hadn't been given. She brought the skillet to the table and set the eggs and pork in front of him and went back for the cornbread she'd been keeping warm, wrapped in a cloth. He looked at the food. He looked at her. "I didn't ask for—" "You didn't have to," she said. She sat down across from him. She had made that decision already, that she would eat at the table with the men and not stand apart and not wait to be invited, because she had found in her experience that the women who waited to be invited never got properly fed and poured her own coffee and started on her plate. He watched her for a moment. Then he picked up his fork. They ate in silence for a while. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had both learned that words were expensive and not to be wasted on things that didn't need saying. After a time, Elias said without looking up from his plate, "The men don't think you'll last." "I know," Martha said. "Doesn't bother you." She considered this. "It bothered me when I was younger," she said. "Now it just tells me where I stand at the start. I'd rather know." He looked up at that. Really looked at her maybe for the first time. Not the way men usually looked at her, that quick, dismissive sweep that cataloged her size and moved on, but the way a person looks at something that has surprised them, and they haven't decided yet what to do with the surprise. "That's a particular way of looking at things," he said. "I've had cause to develop it," she said. He went back to his plate. She went back to hers. Outside, the sky was starting to pale at the edges, and the birds that lived in the cottonwood trees along the creek were starting up their morning argument. And somewhere across the yard, she could hear Sam Miller moving around in the bunkhouse, getting ready to face another day that he probably expected to be exactly like the last one. Martha was already planning how to make it different. She had found behind the house an old kitchen garden that had gone entirely to seed and neglect. She had spotted it the day before from the kitchen window and gone out to look at it in the last of the evening light. The fence around it had fallen in one corner. The paths between the beds were invisible under weeds. But the soil was good, she could tell. Dark and loose where she'd pushed a stick into it. Someone had put real work into that garden once, had cared for it the way you care for something you mean to keep. She had also found in the back of the root cellar 3 paper envelopes of seeds, carrots, beans, and something she couldn't identify tucked behind a broken crock, like someone had saved them and then forgotten they'd saved them. She had put the envelopes in her apron pocket. After breakfast was cleared, and the men had gone to their morning work, and Elias had ridden out to check the south fence, Martha went to the garden. She worked for 2 hours in the heat of the morning, clearing weeds, repairing the corner of the fence with wire she found in the barn, turning the soil with a spade that had seen better days, but still had some work left in it. She sweated through her dress, and her hair came loose from its pins, and she kept working. The physical work didn't bother her. Her size didn't make her weak the way people assumed. It made her solid, grounded. She could work long and hard, and she had never been inclined to stop before a thing was done. When Elias rode back in at midday, he pulled up his horse at the edge of the garden and sat looking at what she'd done. She looked up from where she was kneeling at the far end of the plot, putting in the first of the carrot seeds, and shielded her eyes against the sun. "Didn't ask you to do that," he said. "No, you didn't," she agreed, and went back to the seeds. He was quiet for a long moment. She could feel him still sitting there on the horse watching. "Clara put in that garden," he said at last. His voice had changed, dropped to something quieter and more careful. "My wife. She put it in the first spring we were here." Martha stopped working. She looked up at him again. His face was turned toward the house, not toward her. "I let it go after she passed. Didn't see the point." Martha thought about what to say. She thought about it for long enough that Elias started to turn his horse away, like he regretted saying it. "It's good soil," she said. "Whatever she put into it, it held." He stopped. "She had a gift for things like that," he said, still not looking at Martha. "Making things grow where they oughtn't." "Sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Martha said. "She was." He rode on toward the barn. Martha watched him go. Then she put the next seed in the ground. By the end of that first week, the meals had changed something at Broken Willow that Martha hadn't fully anticipated. She had expected the food to be received well. She knew her own skill, regardless of what anyone else thought of it. But she had not expected the meals to become the thing that the ranch's days began organizing themselves around. It started with supper time. The men had been eating in shifts before Martha arrived, or not eating together at all. Grabbing food, when there was food to grab, and eating standing up or out in the barn, or wherever they happened to be, when hunger found them. There was no table ritual. There was no gathering. Martha changed that on the second night, when she stood at the kitchen doorway and said to whatever men she could see, "Supper's at 6, at the table, all of you." Cord had looked at her with something approaching challenge. "And if we ain't hungry at 6, then you'll be hungry," she said, "and you'll watch the others eat." He had come. They had all come. By the end of the week, 6 o'clock had become a time that mattered. Walter Brooks started washing his hands and face before he came in. Sam Miller, who had initially treated Martha with the particular suspicion of a young man who has decided he knows more than he does, started setting the table without being asked. Henry Davis, who Martha had decided was both deeply calm and deeply damaged, and that these were not contradictory things, started arriving first and sitting in the same chair each time, like the constancy of it was something he needed. And Elias Carter, who had been eating alone in his study since Clara died 3 years ago, came to the table every night. He didn't say much. He never said much. But he was there, which Martha understood was its own kind of statement. On Friday evening after supper, Walter Brooks stopped at the kitchen doorway on his way out and turned back. "Ma'am," he said. He had his hat in his hands and was turning the brim slowly, the way men did when they were trying to say something they didn't quite have the words for. "I want you to know, that meal tonight, that was the best I've eaten since—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "In a long time." "Thank you, Mr. Brooks," Martha said. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" "My grandmother." She must have been something. She was everything, Martha said, and she meant it in a way that didn't need explaining. Walter nodded. He put his hat back on. "Well," he said, "I hope you stay." It was the first time since she'd arrived that anyone had said that. Martha turned back to the stove, so he wouldn't see her face. She was still there when Elias came into the kitchen. An hour later, the house gone quiet around them, the night settling in heavy and dark outside the windows. He stood in the doorway, the way he always did, like he wasn't sure of his welcome in his own house. And Martha had noticed that about him, how carefully he moved through rooms that should have been entirely his, like he was a guest in the life he was supposed to be living. "You fixed the garden fence," he said. "The corner was down. The whole thing needs rebuilding." "Yes," she agreed. "But the corner was the emergency. The rest can wait." He came into the kitchen then, which he hadn't done before. He sat down at the table, not at the head where he sat for meals, but at the side in one of the middle chairs, like he was choosing to be among something rather than in front of it. "The men are different," he said. Martha looked at him. "At supper," he said. "They're I don't know. Different. Walter's been fixing the hinge on the barn door. Didn't ask him to. Henry repaired 2 sections of fence this afternoon, just went and did it. Nobody told him." "People work better when they're properly fed," Martha said. "It's more than that." He looked at the table, at the worn wood of it, the rings left by years of cups and plates. "Clara always said." He stopped. Martha waited. "She always said the kitchen was where a house breathed," he said. "I thought that was just something women said." "Maybe it was something she knew," Martha said. He was quiet for a long time. The wood in the stove settled. Outside, the horses moved in the barn. "Why'd you come here?" he asked at last. "Someone like you. You could have gone somewhere easier, somewhere in town. Better situation than this." Martha thought about answering him with something simple. She thought about deflecting the way she had learned to deflect the quick smile and the shorter answer that left a door closed. Instead, she said, "Because I wasn't wanted in the easier places." He looked at her. "People have opinions about how I look," she said, plain and level, "about what a woman built like me can and can't do. The town positions went to women who looked the part. This one," she shrugged just slightly, "this one nobody else wanted." "So you took the nobody else wanted job," he said. "I've been doing that my whole life," Martha said. "Turns out the things nobody else wants are usually the ones worth having. They just take more work." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something about this ranch." Martha looked at him. "There's a man, name of Charles Whitaker. He's been putting pressure on—" Elias stopped. His jaw tightened. "I'll tell you more when there's more to tell, but I want you to know things might get complicated here before they get better." "All right," Martha said. "You're not worried." She looked at him straight. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I've been managing complicated my entire life. I reckon I can manage a little more." He held her gaze for a moment. And then for the first time since she'd arrived, maybe for the first time in longer than that, Elias Carter smiled. It was small and crooked, and gone almost as soon as it appeared, but it was real, and Martha saw it, and she tucked it away in the same place she kept everything important. Then he stood up, pushed in his chair, and walked back down the hall to his study. Martha turned off the lamp over the stove. She stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, listening to the night sounds of a ranch that had started just barely to remember what it was supposed to be. Tomorrow there would be more to do. There always was. The garden needed more work. The root cellar needed sorting. She had ideas for the week's meals that would stretch what they had further than Cord or Pete would believe possible. There was something troubling coming. Something with the name Whitaker attached to it. And she didn't know yet what shape it would take. But tonight in this kitchen that smelled of the meal she had made and the fire she had tended and the work she had done with her own 2 hands, Martha Whitmore felt something she had been a long time without. She felt like she might just possibly be somewhere she was supposed to be. She picked up her lamp, walked through the house. The Wyoming night was deep and wide and full of stars, and Broken Willow Ranch sat beneath them like something that had stopped falling and hadn't yet figured out it could stand back up. Martha had figured it out for them. She just hadn't told them yet. The morning after Elias told her about Whitaker, Martha woke up before 4 o'clock and lay in the dark listening to the ranch breathe. That was how she thought of it, the ranch breathing. The creak of the old house settling against the night wind. The low sound of horses shifting in the barn. The distant bark of a coyote somewhere out past the south fence, answered by nothing. These were not frightening sounds. They were the sounds of a living place, and a living place, however broken, was always worth fighting for. She dressed in the dark and went downstairs. She had been thinking about Whitaker since Elias said the name. Thinking about the way Elias's jaw had tightened when he said it, the way his whole body had gone careful and closed like a man trying not to show how scared he was. She had seen that kind of fear before. Not the fear of something sudden like a fire or a thrown punch, but the slower fear, the kind that comes from knowing something bad is moving toward you and not knowing yet how close it is. She put the coffee on and started on breakfast and let herself think it through. A man named Whitaker was putting pressure on the ranch. Elias hadn't told her more than that, but he had told her enough to know that whatever was coming, it wasn't going to announce itself politely. Men like Whitaker and she had encountered the type in one form or another. Her whole life didn't put pressure on things without a plan behind the pressure. They came after what they wanted in ways that looked legal until you got close enough to see the rot underneath. She was still thinking about it when Henry Davis walked into the kitchen at 4:20. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up from the biscuit dough she was working. "Didn't expect anyone else up this early," he said. "Sit down, Mr. Davis," she said. "Coffee's on." He sat. He moved the way he always moved, that careful stillness, like a man who had learned at some point that moving suddenly got things broken. She poured him a cup and set it in front of him and went back to her biscuits. They were quiet for a while. Henry Davis held his cup in both hands and looked at the surface of his coffee like it was telling him something. Then he said, "You know about Whitaker." It wasn't a question. Martha kept working the dough. "Mr. Carter mentioned there might be complications," she said. "Complications." Henry said the word like he was tasting it and finding it insufficient. "Charles Whitaker has been trying to get his hands on this land for 2 years. He's got a lawyer in Casper who keeps finding problems with the deed records. Last month he sent a man out here to—" Henry stopped. His hands tightened around the cup. To make sure Elias understood the offer was serious, Martha looked up from the dough. "What does that mean?" Henry met her eyes. "It means the man said things to Elias that you don't say to another man, unless you're very confident he won't do anything about it." The kitchen was quiet. "And Elias didn't do anything about it," Martha said. "Elias," Henry said carefully, "hasn't been himself since Clara passed. Another pause. "He used to be the kind of man who would have met that fella at the gate and sent him back missing a tooth. Now he just absorbs it. Like he doesn't think he's worth defending." Martha pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. "How long has it been," she said, "since anyone on this ranch felt like they were worth defending?" Henry didn't answer right away. He looked back at his coffee. "Long time," he said at last. "Long time, ma'am." "Well," Martha said, cutting the first biscuit with the rim of a tin cup, because there was no proper cutter in this kitchen, and she had been making do. "That's going to change." Henry looked at her. "Starting with breakfast," she said, and she slid the first tray into the oven. The biscuits came out the way biscuits only come out when the person making them understands that biscuits are not complicated, but they are unforgiving, tall and golden, and split along the top in a way that let out a breath of steam when you pulled them apart. Martha put them on the table with a crock of butter she had found hiding behind the salt barrel and a jar of preserved peaches she had discovered in the back of the root cellar the day before, covered in a year's worth of dust and completely intact inside. When Sam Miller came in and saw peach preserves on the table, he stopped walking. "Where did those come from?" he asked. "Root cellar," Martha said, behind the cracked crock on the left shelf. "I've been in that root cellar 100 times. You weren't looking for them," Martha said. "Sit down." He sat. He put a biscuit on his plate and split it open and spread butter on it, and then opened the jar of peaches and spooned them over the top and took a bite, and his eyes closed for half a second. Just half a second, like the taste of it had taken him somewhere else briefly, and he'd allowed himself to go. When he opened them, Martha was looking at him. "My mother used to make peach preserves," he said. He said it like he was confessing something. "A lot of mothers did," Martha said. "Sit down and eat before the others come in." He sat. He ate. And there was something in the way he held his biscuit, careful, deliberate, like he didn't want to get to the end of it too fast, that told Martha everything she needed to know about how long it had been since anyone at Broken Willow had tasted something that reminded them of being cared for. Cord came in at 5:30 with his usual expression of preemptive dissatisfaction and stopped when he saw what was on the table. "Biscuits," he said, like he wasn't sure they were real. "And preserves," Pete said from behind him, already reaching for a chair. Cord sat down without another word and ate 4 biscuits in the time it took most men to eat 2. Martha watched him do it and didn't say anything, but she filed it away. Cord was the one who had said she wouldn't last the week. Cord was the one who had the loudest doubts. And Cord had just eaten 4 of her biscuits in silence. That was something. Elias came in last, as he usually did, and looked at the table with the same expression he always wore in the morning, that particular blankness of a man who has stopped expecting mornings to offer him anything good. Then he saw the biscuits and the butter and the peach preserves, and he went very still. "Where did you find—" He stopped. "Root cellar," Martha said. "Left shelf behind the cracked crock." He sat down slowly. He picked up a biscuit. He pulled it apart, and the steam came out, and he looked at it for a long moment before he spread the butter and the peaches and took a bite. He chewed. He swallowed. Then he said so quietly that only Martha standing nearest to him could hear it. "Clara made these." Martha kept her expression steady. "The recipe. The preserves. She put them up the summer before she—" He stopped again, set the biscuit down, picked up his coffee. "I didn't know they were still there." "She saved them well," Martha said. Elias looked at her then. His eyes were doing the thing they did when something got through the wall he had built, that slight widening, that involuntary openness that he always shut down quickly, but not quite quickly enough. "You could have just thrown them out," he said, "if you didn't know what they were." "I don't throw things out," Martha said, "until I know for certain they've got nothing left to give." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up the biscuit again and finished it. The day moved fast after breakfast, the way days on a working ranch do, when there's real work to be done, and the people doing it have started to remember why it matters. Walter Brooks spent the morning on the barn hinge, which had graduated from a simple fix to a full rebuilding project once he got into it, as these things always do, and Martha could hear him working from the kitchen window, steady and methodical, the kind of man who finished what he started. Sam Miller, she noticed, had taken it upon himself to start clearing the brush from along the south side of the garden fence she'd been working on without anyone asking him to, and without making a production of it. He just did it quietly, with the same focus he brought to eating her biscuits. Henry Davis was gone most of the morning on some task Elias had assigned him, and Dutch and Pete were out on the range and Cord was. She wasn't entirely sure where Cord was, which she filed away as something to pay attention to. Because in her experience, the loudest doubters either came around or they made trouble, and there was no way yet to know which kind Cord was going to be. At 10:30, she went out to the garden with a hoe and got to work on the second bed. She had been at it for about 20 minutes when she heard the horse. Not the ranch horses, she knew their sounds by now, the particular rhythm of each of them in the paddock or the barn. This was a different horse coming up the main approach at a pace that was not urgent, but was deliberate. The pace of someone who knows where they're going and is in no hurry, because they're confident about what they'll find when they get there. Martha straightened up and turned around. The man who rode in on that horse was not large, which she hadn't expected. She had built Charles Whitaker in her mind as the kind of man who used physical size to make his point the way powerful men often do. But this man was compact, neatly dressed for a ranch visit, in a way that said he wanted to look like he belonged, but hadn't quite managed it. He had a thin face with small, precise features, and eyes that moved quickly over everything. The yard, the house, the barn, the fence, cataloging and assessing in a way that Martha recognized instantly, because she did it herself. Only she suspected their purposes were very different. His gaze reached her last. He looked at her the way some men look at things they have already decided aren't important. "I'm looking for Elias Carter," he said. He didn't get down from his horse. "He's on the property," Martha said. She didn't put down her hoe. "Then fetch him," the man said. Martha looked at him steadily. "I don't believe I know your name," she said. Something moved across the man's face. Not quite annoyance, more like the mild surprise of a man who isn't used to being asked anything at all. "Reginald Cross," he said. "I'm an associate of Mr. Charles Whitaker." "I see," Martha said. "And what is your business with Mr. Carter?" "That's between me and Carter," Cross said. "Now if you'd be so good as to—" "I'll let him know you're here," Martha said. "You can wait in the yard." She stuck her hoe in the ground and walked to the house without hurrying. And she did not look back to see what expression Reginald Cross was wearing, though she could feel it on the back of her neck like a brand. She found Elias in his study going over papers and knocked once on the open door. He looked up. "There's a man in the yard," she said. "Reginald Cross. Says he's an associate of Charles Whitaker's." Elias went still. Not the gentle stillness of Henry Davis, but a rigid, sudden kind of stillness, like something inside him had locked. "How many men with him?" he said. "Just himself," Martha said. "But the kind of man who thinks he doesn't need more than himself." Elias looked at the papers on his desk for a moment. Then he stood up and pushed his chair back and straightened his shirt, the gesture of a man trying to put on an exterior that matched the situation. Martha stepped back from the doorway to let him pass, and as he went by her, she said quietly, "Don't let him in the house." Elias stopped, looked at her. "Whatever he's got to say," she said, "say it in the yard. On your terms, not his." Something passed through Elias's eyes. It was not the widening she had seen at breakfast. It was something sharper, more deliberate. He nodded once, and he walked out to the yard. Martha went back to the kitchen, where she had a clean line of sight through the window to where the two men were now talking. She could not hear the words. She watched the bodies instead. Elias had his arms at his sides, not crossed, not defensive. Reginald Cross had gotten off his horse now and was holding an envelope that he had produced from his inside coat pocket, and he was talking with the careful, measured delivery of a man who has rehearsed this. Every few sentences, he would extend the envelope slightly toward Elias, and every time Elias did not take it. That was good. That was the right thing. But Martha could see even from the kitchen window the way Elias's shoulders were carrying the weight of the conversation. They had dropped slightly drawn in the posture of a man absorbing something he doesn't know how to deflect. Cross was still talking. He had opened the envelope himself now and was holding out a document pointing at things on it. Legal language, Martha guessed. Numbers and dates and phrases that sounded authoritative because they were designed to. She dried her hands on her apron. She walked out to the yard. Cross looked up when she came out. His expression moved quickly through surprise and arrived at something that Martha could only describe as contemptuous patience, the look of a man who finds an interruption irritating but beneath his direct attention. "This is a private conversation," he said. "Mr. Carter's cook," Martha said, coming to stand beside Elias. "I thought you might want water, Mr. Carter. It's warm out." She handed Elias a tin cup she had brought with her. He took it. His hand was steady. Cross looked at her for a moment with those quick-moving eyes, and Martha looked back at him without expression, and something passed between them that was not exactly communication, but was absolutely understood by both of them. He looked back at Elias. "The offer stands through end of the month," he said. "Mr. Whitaker is being generous with the timeline. He doesn't have to be. I appreciate you riding out, Elias said. His voice was careful and controlled in a way that Martha could hear the effort behind. I'll consider what you've said. See that you do, Cross said. He folded the document and put it back in the envelope and held it out one more time. Take this. Read it with a lawyer if you've got one who'll come out this far. Elias took the envelope. Cross looked at Martha one more time. That same quick cataloging sweep. She watched him decide she wasn't worth any more of his attention and look away. He got back on his horse and rode out the way he came. The yard was very quiet for a moment. Then Elias looked down at the envelope in his hands. His jaw was tight. His shoulders were still carrying that weight. He says there's a problem with the original deed, he said. Says the land was surveyed wrong back in '71, and the water access rights aren't valid. Let me see it, Martha said. He looked at her. The document, she said. Let me read it. You're the cook, he said, not unkindly, more like he was reminding himself. I can read, she said, and I can tell the difference between something that's legally sound and something that's written to sound legally sound. They're not the same thing. He handed her the envelope. She opened it there in the yard and read it standing in the sun. It was 4 pages dense with language that was clearly written to intimidate rather than inform. She had seen this kind of document before. Her uncle had lost 40 acres in Tennessee to something very similar, and her grandmother had spent 2 years trying to untangle it after the fact. She read every word. Then she folded it back up and put it in the envelope and handed it to Elias. The survey claim might have some validity, she said. Might. But the water rights argument is built on a clause that only applies to territories, not states. Wyoming's been a territory until just recently, and the transition changes the legal ground. Whoever wrote this is gambling that you won't know that. Elias stared at her. Where did you learn? My uncle lost his land, she said. I read every document that came through his house for 2 years trying to find the way out. We didn't find it in time. I learned anyway. He was still staring. You need to find your original deed, she said. The actual survey documents from when Clara's family filed on this land. They'll be somewhere on the property or at the territorial office in Cheyenne. And you need to find them before end of the month. The silence in the yard was the silence of a man reassembling himself around a new understanding of his situation. All right, Elias said. Where would Clara have kept important papers? Martha asked. He blinked. Then something moved across his face, that raw, involuntary grief that he usually kept locked away. Her room, he said. I haven't gone through her things. Then that's where we start, Martha said. He looked at her for a long moment. The Wyoming sun was overhead, and the yard was warm, and somewhere in the barn, Walter was still working on that hinge with his steady, methodical hammer. Why are you doing this? Elias asked. This isn't you weren't hired to. No. Martha agreed. I wasn't hired to, but I don't stop at what I was hired to do. I never have. She paused. This ranch is worth saving, Mr. Carter. Anyone can see that, including you if you'll let yourself look. He was quiet for a moment that stretched out long enough that Martha almost moved on. Then he said, Clara's room is upstairs. Second door on the right. I'll show you. He led her upstairs without another word. The room was the room of a woman who had cared about things. Not a woman of great wealth, but a woman who had chosen what she owned carefully and maintained it with attention. There was a writing desk against the wall under the window, a small bookshelf with a dozen books that had clearly been read, a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. The room had been closed up since Clara died, and the smell of it was cedar and old lavender and thyme. Elias stood in the doorway and did not come in. Martha understood that and did not ask him to. She went to the writing desk first. The drawers were neat, not untouched, but organized by someone who had known what they were doing. Letters, a household account book, a journal that Martha set aside without opening because it was not hers to open. and in the bottom drawer, under a folded piece of cloth, a leather portfolio tied with cord. She undid the cord and opened it. Land deed. Survey documents. A letter from the territorial office dated 1872. A hand-drawn map of the property boundaries with notations in handwriting she didn't recognize a surveyor's hand, she thought careful and precise. She stood at Clara's desk and read through every page. From the doorway, Elias said, "What is it?" "Everything we need," Martha said. He came into the room then. Came to stand beside her at the desk close enough that she could feel the tension coming off him like heat. She showed him each document, walked him through what it meant. The original survey was accurate and had been filed correctly. The water rights were explicitly included and had been included since the original filing. There was nothing in any of these documents that gave Whitaker's claim any real ground to stand on. "He's bluffing," Martha said, "or close to it. He's betting you don't have these or that you can't read them or that you're too worn down to fight." Elias took the deed from her hands and held it, stared at it. "Clara filed all this herself," he said. "After her father passed and left her the land, she came out here alone and filed everything herself. 22 years old." His voice had gone to that quiet, careful place again. "She never told me it had been complicated. She just handled it." "She was thorough," Martha said. "Be glad she was." He lowered the deed, looked at Martha. "What do we do now?" he said. "You get these documents to a lawyer," Martha said. "Not the one in Casper who Whitaker's already got in his pocket. Someone in Cheyenne. Henry Davis could make the ride." "Henry would do it," Elias said slowly, like he was thinking out loud. "He's made that ride before." "Good. And in the meantime, you don't respond to Whitaker. You don't send word, you don't acknowledge the offer. You don't let Cross back on this property without a witness present." Elias looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light was coming through the window and lying across Clara's desk, and the portfolio of documents that might save everything. "Martha," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the formality of a title attached to it. She looked at him. "Why does this matter to you?" he said. "Honest answer." She thought about it. She gave him the honest answer. "Because I know what it looks like when something worth saving gets thrown away," she said. "I've seen it happen to land and to people and to everything in between, and I can't stand by and watch it happen if there's something I can do about it." He held her gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he looked back down at the deed in his hands. "All right," he said. "We do it your way." They came back downstairs with the portfolio, and Elias called Henry Davis in from wherever he'd been, and the two of them stood in the kitchen while Martha made coffee and listened to Elias explain what needed to happen. Henry listened with that complete quiet attention he brought to everything, and when Elias finished, Henry said, "I'll ride for Cheyenne first light." "You know a lawyer there?" Martha asked. "I know a man who knows the right lawyer," Henry said. "He owes me a favor I never called in." "Call it in," Martha said. Henry looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said. After Henry had taken the portfolio to his bunk to keep it safe overnight, and after Elias had gone back to his study with the look of a man who has just remembered he has some fight left in him, Martha stood alone in the kitchen and let herself breathe for a moment. The situation was not resolved, not even close. Whitaker was not a man who would retreat at the first sign of resistance, and whatever pressure he had been applying to this ranch would not decrease just because Elias had found his documents. If anything, it would increase because men like Whitaker did not respond to defiance by backing down. They responded by escalating. Martha knew that. She had seen it before. But what had changed today was this. Elias Carter knew what he had. He knew what Clara had built and preserved and left him. And he knew he was not facing this alone. Sometimes that was enough to change everything. Supper that night was the best meal she had made yet. Not because the ingredients were better, they were the same as always, supplemented by a rabbit that Dutch had come in with that afternoon, which she'd dressed and put in a pot with the last of the root vegetables and fresh herbs from the garden. But the meal tasted different because the people eating it were different. Something had shifted at that table, some atmospheric change that Martha could feel but not name precisely. Walter and Sam were talking to each other. Really talking, not just passing salt and grunting. Pete was telling Dutch about something that had happened out on the range that afternoon, that had apparently been either terrifying or funny or both. And their voices kept rising and then dropping down again as the story required. And Elias Carter sat at the head of his table with the leather portfolio tucked under his chair, and he ate his supper, and he did not look like a man waiting to lose everything. He looked for the first time since Martha had arrived like a man who might choose to keep it. She was washing up at the end of the night, the house gone quiet around her, when she heard a sound from upstairs that stopped her hands. It was faint. She wasn't certain she had heard it. She stood still and listened. There it was again. The sound of someone moving in Clara's room. She dried her hands and went upstairs, moving quietly, and stood in the hall outside the second door on the right. The door was open an inch. Through the inch, she could see the lamp was lit. She didn't push the door open. She didn't knock. She heard Elias's voice very low, the way you speak when you're speaking to someone who can't hear you, but you need to say it anyway. "I've got someone here," he was saying. "Someone who I don't know what she is. I don't know what to do with that. But I think you'd have liked her, Clara. I think you'd have said she was the right kind of person." A long pause. "I'm still here," he said. "Broke Willow's still standing. I wanted you to know." Martha stepped back from the door and went back downstairs. She stood in the kitchen in the dark for a long time without lighting the lamp. She was not a woman given to crying. She had spent too many years needing to be solid for herself to fall apart easily. But her throat was tight and her eyes were warm, and she stood there in the dark kitchen of Broken Willow Ranch and let herself feel it, the full weight of what this place was and what was at risk, and what she had walked into when she arrived here with her suitcase and her skillet and her grandmother's recipe book, and nowhere better to be. She was not useless here. She was not too much here. She was exactly what this place needed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the place she was in might be exactly what she needed too. She lit the lamp. She got out her grandmother's recipe book. She started planning tomorrow's meals, and she was still planning when the clock in the hall struck midnight, and the coyotes out past the south fence started up again, and the ranch breathed around her steady and alive, like something that had decided it wasn't done after all. Henry Davis rode out for Cheyenne before the sun came up. Martha heard him go. She was already in the kitchen, already had the fire going, already had her hands in dough when she heard the single set of hoofbeats move down the main approach and fade out into the dark. She said a quiet word into the silence of the kitchen that wasn't quite a prayer and wasn't quite a promise, but was somewhere between the two, and then she went back to her biscuits. She didn't tell anyone at breakfast that Henry was gone on an errand. Elias hadn't told the other men about Whitaker, at least not in any detail, and Martha wasn't going to be the one to change that before he was ready. What she knew was that secrets had a weight to them, and that the best way to keep men from noticing a weight was to give them something else to carry. So she put a meal on that table that required their full attention. Biscuits, salt pork, fried potatoes, and a pot of thick gravy that Dutch said with complete sincerity was the best thing he had eaten since his mother died, and she let the conversation fill the room and watched Elias sit in his chair at the head of the table and hold himself together. He was doing it well. Better than she'd expected. The night in Clara's room had done something for him that she couldn't name precisely, but could see clearly some reordering of himself around a steadier center. He ate his breakfast and answered when the men spoke to him, and only once when Sam asked where Henry was did something flicker behind his eyes. "Errand?" Elias said. "He'll be back in a few days." Sam nodded and went back to his potatoes. Martha refilled Elias's coffee without being asked. After breakfast, after the men had gone to their work, Elias came to the kitchen doorway. "Thank you," he said, "for this morning." "It's just breakfast," Martha said. "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked at him. "You kept them from asking questions I didn't want to answer yet," he said. I noticed. Martha set down her dishcloth. How long do you think we have before Whitaker moves again? Elias leaned against the doorframe. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and it did him no favors. He looked tired in it, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't recognize the ranch, that I didn't fold when he came out. Whitaker will see that as resistance, and he doesn't like resistance. He paused. A week, maybe less. Then we use the week, Martha said. She spent the rest of that morning doing something she had been planning since she first arrived at Broken Willow, but had not yet had the opening to do. She went through every drawer, every shelf, every corner of the house that wasn't someone's private space, looking for anything that might be relevant to the ranch's legal standing. Not because she expected to find more than what was in Clara's portfolio, those documents had been thorough and well kept, but because she had learned that when someone is trying to take something from you, the attack rarely comes from the direction you're looking. She found things. Not legal documents, but information. Old letters from neighboring ranchers. A record book Elias had kept in the first years of the ranch that showed water usage and crop yields. A notice from the county office regarding a boundary survey from 1878 that had apparently been requested by a neighboring property owner and then never followed up on. That last one she set aside and looked at for a long time. The neighboring property owner who had requested the survey was listed as W. Hargrove. She didn't know that name. But the year was 1878, 5 years before Clara died, 7 years before Martha arrived, and the survey had been requested specifically along the eastern boundary where the creek ran, where the water access was. She folded the notice and put it in her apron pocket and kept moving. At midday, she brought lunch out to the men working in the yard. Not a formal meal, just bread and cheese and dried meat and water. The kind of fuel that lets a person keep working without stopping. And she moved among them the way she always did, quiet and efficient and paying attention to everything. It was when she came to Cord that she noticed something was wrong. He was working on the far side of the barn, supposedly repairing a section of the corral fence. But when Martha came around the corner with his bread and water, he was standing still, not working, with his back to the barn wall and his hat pulled low. He had a folded piece of paper in his hand that he pushed into his shirt pocket the moment he heard her coming. Martha had learned over a long life to notice what people put away quickly when they saw her. "Lunch," she said, holding out the bread and water. Cord took it without meeting her eyes. "Thanks," he said. "Hot day," she said. She stood where she was. He took a bite of the bread, chewed, said nothing. "You hear anything in town before you came back out this week?" she asked. Casual, like she was asking about the weather. Cord looked up at her then. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that knew it was being looked at and didn't like it. "Why would I hear anything in town?" he said. "You went in for supplies Tuesday," Martha said. "Most men pick up talk along with their flour." "I don't pay attention to talk," Cord said. Martha nodded, took that in, said, "All right then, come in before 6 if you want the hot meal. I'm making venison stew tonight." She walked back around the barn. She did not go back inside immediately. She stood on the far side of the house, in the shadow of the wall, and thought about what she had just seen. A man who avoided eye contact, who put a piece of paper away fast, who answered a simple question with a deflection so quick and practiced, it didn't sound like a deflection unless you were listening for one. She thought about what Henry had said, about how Whitaker had sent a man out to make sure Elias understood the offer was serious. Men like Whitaker didn't just send one representative, they also cultivated information. And the best place to cultivate information inside a thing you wanted was to have someone already inside it. She went back to the kitchen and started on the venison stew and thought about Cord the whole time she cooked. She did not say anything to Elias that afternoon. She did not have enough yet to say anything that wouldn't just be suspicion. And suspicion directed at the wrong person or directed at the right person at the wrong time could do more damage than saying nothing at all. What she did was watch. At supper that night, Cord was quieter than usual, which she would not have noticed 2 weeks ago, but noticed now because supper at Broken Willow had gradually become something different, louder, more alive men who had been living parallel, isolated lives, beginning slowly and reluctantly, and then with increasing ease, to actually talk to each other. That Cord sat apart from this pushing stew around his bowl and answering when spoken to, and contributing nothing else, was not nothing. After supper, after the other men had gone, Elias sat at the table a little longer than usual. He was holding his coffee cup in both hands and looking at the middle distance the way he did when he was working through something. Martha sat down across from him. She had not asked permission, and she did not ask it now. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. He looked. She told him about Cord, about the paper, the quick hands, the deflection. She told him about the survey notice she had found, and the name W. Hargrove on it. She laid it all out flat, without drama, the way her grandmother had taught her to present hard information, clearly, directly, without decoration. Because decoration was what people added when they weren't sure of what they were saying, and Martha was sure. Elias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Cord's been with me 3 years, he said. "I know," Martha said. "That doesn't change what I saw." Another long pause. His jaw worked. "Hargrove," he said. "James Hargrove owned the eastern section before Whitaker bought him out. About 4 years back. Which means if Hargrove requested a survey along our eastern boundary, then Whitaker had the survey done before he even approached you," Martha said. "He's known the exact boundary situation for years. Whatever he's claiming about your deed, he already knows whether it's valid or not." Elias set down his coffee cup. "He knows it's not," he said. "He knows it's not," Martha confirmed. The silence in the kitchen had a different quality now. Heavier, more purposeful. "So this isn't about a legal dispute," Elias said slowly. "It's about pressure. He's using legal language to pressure me into selling something he can't actually take." "That's how I read it," Martha said. "Which means Henry's trip to Cheyenne matters less than I thought in terms of the legal fight. We probably have more solid ground than we realized." "Then why does this feel worse?" Elias said. Martha looked at him. "Because if Whitaker knows he can't take this land legally, he'll try something else," she said. "And if he's got someone in this ranch already." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Elias stood up from the table. He was not the man who had met Martha at the front door 3 weeks ago, the collapsed, exhausted man with the tired eyes and the faded shirt. He was something else now, still tired, still carrying his grief. But there was a sharpness to him that grief had blunted, and these weeks had started to restore. "I need to think," he said. "Think fast," Martha said. "Whitaker's not waiting." He was almost at the kitchen doorway when she said, "Don't let Cord know you're watching him." Elias stopped. "He doesn't know that I noticed," she said. "That's an advantage. Don't spend it early." He looked back at her over his shoulder. In that moment, in the lamplight of the kitchen that had become the heart of this house, he looked at her the way you look at someone you have just understood more fully than you had before. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition arriving on its own schedule. "All right," he said, and he went to bed. Martha did not go to bed for a long time. She sat at the kitchen table, with the lamp low, and the survey notice spread out in front of her, and her grandmother's recipe book beside it, not because she needed a recipe, but because the book was the thing she held when she needed to think the way other people held a rosary, or a coin, or a piece of a letter from someone they loved. She was not frightened. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She was not frightened by Whitaker, or by what he might try next, or by the possibility that there was a man in this ranch who was feeding him information. She had been in worse situations. She had been the woman nobody warned because nobody thought she mattered enough to warn. She had been the woman in the room when decisions were made over her head about her own life. She had learned to see trouble coming from a long way off because she had needed to, because nobody had ever looked out for her, and she had needed to look out for herself. What she felt was not fear. It was anger. The clean, quiet kind, the kind that doesn't burn itself out quickly, but burns steady like a well-tended fire that knows it's got a long night ahead of it. She had found something worth caring about at Broken Willow Ranch. She had not expected to, and she was still not entirely sure what to do with it. But she was not going to stand by and watch it be taken apart by a man who thought the way to get what he wanted was to wear down the people standing in his way. She was not easily worn down. She put the survey notice away, closed her grandmother's book, and went to bed. 3 days passed. On the surface of them, they were good days. The garden was growing, she could see it now. The first green of the carrot tops, thin and tentative, pushing up through the dark soil she had turned and tended. The biscuits had become a morning ritual that the men protected with a seriousness they applied to almost nothing else. Walter had finished the barn hinge and moved on to the corral fence, working alongside Sam, now the two of them falling into an easy rhythm that Martha thought neither of them had noticed yet. Pete had started washing his face before coming to meals without being told. Dutch, who had initially regarded Martha with the professional wariness of a man who has learned not to trust things that seem too good, had begun leaving small offerings at the kitchen door, a rabbit one morning, a handful of wild onions. Another with no comment and no expectation of acknowledgement, which Martha understood as the highest compliment his particular character was capable of paying. She watched Cord. She watched him carefully and without appearing to watch him at all. He did his work. He came to meals. He said the things a man says when he is trying to appear normal. But twice more she saw him go still when he thought no one was near, and once she saw him standing at the edge of the property in the direction of the eastern fence, looking out at nothing for long enough that it meant something. Elias watched him too. She could tell. He did it better than she'd expected. He had his own particular kind of stillness when he needed it, and he deployed it now, going about his days and talking to Cord the same way he always had, giving nothing away. Henry came back on the 4th day. He rode in at midday and came directly to the kitchen where Martha was making lunch. He sat down at the table and she put coffee in front of him and waited. "The lawyer's name is Thomas Aldrich," Henry said. "He looked at everything I brought him. Clara's deed, the survey documents, the water rights filing." He paused. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "He said the claim is garbage, his exact word. He said whoever Whitaker's got writing his legal letters is counting on the target being too scared or too ignorant to challenge it." "We already suspected that," Martha said. "There's more," Henry said. She looked at him. "Aldrich knows Whitaker. Not personally, but professionally. Whitaker's tried this with 3 other ranchers in the territory over the past 5 years. 2 of them sold. 1 of them didn't, and 6 months later, his barn burned down." The kitchen went very quiet. "Accidentally," Henry said. The way he said the word made clear what he thought of its accuracy. Martha set down the pot she was holding. Slowly, carefully. "Did Aldrich say which ranch?" she said. "Kellerman Place, out near Douglas. You know it." "She didn't, but she filed the name away. He's sending a formal response to Whitaker's lawyer," Henry continued, "notarized with copies filed in Cheyenne. It tells Whitaker in legal terms that his claim has no basis and that any further pressure will be met with legal action." Henry took a long drink of his coffee. "But he said something else. He said the letter might not stop Whitaker. It'll make him look elsewhere for leverage." "Because he's not actually trying to win in court," Martha said. "That's what Aldrich thinks too," Henry said. "He said to be careful. Said men like Whitaker, they don't lose gracefully." Martha nodded. She picked the pot back up and went back to the stove. "Henry," she said, her back to him, "did anyone in Cheyenne know you were coming? Know why?" A pause. "I didn't tell anyone," Henry said slowly. "But I stayed at the Frontier Hotel the first night. Signed the register." "Did you say where you were from?" Another pause. Longer. "I said I was riding for Carter out of Broken Willow," Henry said, and then catching what she was implying, "Lord." "It's all right," Martha said. "But it means Whitaker may already know you went to see a lawyer, which means we have less time than we thought." Henry put his cup down. "I'll tell Elias." "We'll both tell him," Martha said. "At supper, with everyone present." Henry looked at her. Everyone. Everyone, she said, including Cord. Henry understood immediately. She could see it in the way he went still, and then very deliberately went unstill, picking up his coffee again with the careful steadiness of a man recalibrating. "You're going to watch how he reacts," Henry said. "I'm going to watch how everyone reacts," Martha said. But yes, that evening at supper she made the best meal she had put on that table yet. Not because the occasion called for it in any celebratory sense, but because she had learned that when you needed people to stay at a table, to stay present and attentive and in their bodies, you fed them something that commanded their full attention. She made a venison roast that had been slow cooking all day with the last of the wild onions Dutch had brought and dried herbs from the garden and the remaining bacon fat. She made 3 loaves of bread, real yeast bread, made from a starter she had been cultivating since her 2nd week, because she had learned to build things for the long term. She made a gravy that made Walter Brooks close his eyes for a full 3 seconds when he tasted it. She put it all on this table. She sat down. She waited for everyone to have food in front of them. Then Elias said in the quiet voice he used when something mattered, "Henry's got news from Cheyenne. I want everyone to hear it." Henry told it straight. He laid out what the lawyer had said about the deed about the water rights about Whitaker's history with other ranches. He said the word garbage, the way Aldrich had said it, and watched it land around the table. Sam said, "So he can't take the ranch." "Not legally?" Henry said. "That doesn't mean he won't try other ways." Martha was watching Cord. She had been watching Cord since before Henry started talking, watching the precise angle of his head, the way he was holding his fork, the quality of his attention to the food in front of him. When Henry said the word garbage, and the table relaxed around that word the way people relax when they hear good news, Cord did not relax. His hand holding the fork went slightly tighter. It was barely visible. Martha would not have caught it 2 weeks ago. She caught it now. She caught it, and she put it away, and she kept her face entirely neutral. Walter was talking now something about what they ought to do about the eastern fence, if Whitaker was eyeing the boundary there, and Pete was agreeing, and Sam was asking questions, and the table had become the kind of alive that it became when people who have something worth protecting start talking about how to protect it. And Cord said, after a pause that was just a fraction too long, "You trust this lawyer man you never met before?" Elias looked at him. "Henry vouches for him. Still," Cord said. He pushed food around his plate. "Might be smarter to just consider the offer. If Whitaker's serious about the land fighting him, might cost more than selling." The table went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind that happens when something has been said that has changed the temperature of the room, and everyone is deciding how to respond to the new temperature. Martha looked at her plate. Walter said slowly, "This is Elias's land, Cord, and Clara's before him. We don't talk about selling it like it's a business decision." "Everything's a business decision," Cord said. "I'm just being practical." "You're being something," Dutch said. He said it quietly. He was looking at Cord the way Dutch looked at things he had already made up his mind about. Elias had not said anything. Martha looked at him. His face was completely controlled, but his hands were flat on the table on either side of his plate, not gripping, not tense, just deliberately, consciously flat, and she knew that meant he was working very hard to keep himself level. "I appreciate the concern, Cord," Elias said. His voice was measured. "This ranch isn't for sale." Cord looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded and went back to eating. The conversation resumed gradually, but it had changed quality. There was a seam in it now, a place where the temperature had shifted and hadn't quite shifted back. After supper, after the men had gone, after Elias had looked at Martha across the cleared table with an expression that said he had seen what she'd seen, and he had seen Cord's hands on the fork, and he was done doubting what she'd told him. After all of that, Martha washed the dishes and thought hard and fast about what came next. Because the next thing that came was not what she had predicted. She was in bed, but not asleep. She rarely slept deeply. She had lived too many years in situations where sleeping deeply was a luxury she couldn't afford when she heard it. A horse. Moving fast. Not from the main approach. From the eastern side of the property. She was up and dressed in under 2 minutes. She went to the window at the end of the upstairs hall that faced east and looked out. She could see in the thin moonlight a rider moving away from the property at a gallop. Moving east. Toward the boundary where the creek ran and where Whitaker's acquired land started. She could not see who it was. She didn't need to. She went to Elias's door and knocked 3 times hard. He opened it faster than a man should have been able to open it if he had been sleeping, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. "Rider," she said. "East fence. Just left." His face did something complicated and then went still. "Cord," he said. "I believe so." "He went to Whitaker," Elias said. "Or to someone who'll get word to Whitaker," Martha said. "What he told him what he knows." She thought it through quickly. He knows Henry went to Cheyenne. He knows about Aldrich. He may know about the documents. Elias was already pulling on his boots. "What are you doing?" she said. "I'm going after—" "No," Martha said. "Don't." He looked up at her from where he was crouching, one boot half on. "If you go after him now in the dark, you don't know what you're riding into," she said. "Whitaker might have men waiting. And Cord coming back to an empty house is information for us." Elias stared at her. "He doesn't know we saw him go," she said. "He thinks we're asleep. That's the last advantage we have, and we cannot throw it away." Elias's jaw was tight enough to crack. He sat there with his boot half on for a moment that felt very long, and then he pulled it the rest of the way on and stood up. "All right," he said. "Then what?" "Tomorrow morning," Martha said, "you act like everything is normal. We have breakfast. Cord comes in and sits down like always. And you treat him like always." "You want me to sit at a table with a man who just—" "Yes," Martha said. "Because by the time he comes back, I need to have made some decisions about how we use what we know." Elias looked at her. In the dark hallway of his house, in the thin light coming from the window at the end of the hall, he looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. It was not the surprise of the first week, or the careful gratitude of the last. It was something rawer than either of those more direct. "Martha," he said. She waited. "I don't know what I would have done without you here," he said. "I don't know if this ranch would still be standing." She held his gaze. She did not deflect, and she did not minimize, because she had spent too much of her life doing both of those things, and she was done with it. "It would have been standing," she said. "You're stronger than you think you are. You just forgot for a while." He held her gaze for a moment. "What I haven't forgotten," he said, "is that a good person, when they find one, is the rarest thing in the world." Martha's throat was tight. She kept her voice steady. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow comes early." She went back to her room. She lay down on her bed in the dark and listened to the ranch breathe around her. The horses in the barn, the wind in the cottonwoods, the distant coyotes asking their endless questions of the night. She was not naive. Tomorrow was going to be hard. Whatever Cord had told Whitaker tonight, whatever Whitaker decided to do with that information that was coming. And when it came, it would not come politely. But here was what Martha Whitmore knew, lying in the dark in the small room at the end of the hall of a ranch that she had come to against everyone's expectations and everyone's doubts, including, if she was honest, her own. She had faced hard things before. She had faced hard things alone before, which was the harder kind of hard. She was not alone here. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything. She closed her eyes. She planned breakfast. And somewhere on the eastern boundary of Broken Willow Ranch, the creek ran on in the dark over rocks it had been running over for 100 years, carrying water that belonged to this land toward a morning that was going to ask everything of the people who claimed it. Cord came back at dawn. Martha heard him come in through the bunkhouse door at the same time. She heard the first bird start up in the cottonwoods, and she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the bunkhouse and did not move for a full 5 minutes. Then she turned back to the stove and started breakfast, like it was any other morning, because that was the plan, and she trusted the plan even when every instinct she had was telling her to do something faster and louder and more immediate. Elias came down at 5 o'clock. He came into the kitchen and she handed him his coffee, and he looked at her with a question in his eyes. "He's back," she said quietly. "Came in maybe an hour ago." Elias took his coffee and sat down at the table and said nothing. His face was the controlled face, the one he wore when what was underneath it was too much to show. "Eat your breakfast," Martha said, "and be the same man you were yesterday." He looked at her. "Can you do that?" she said. A pause. Then, yes. She believed him. The men came in one by one, the way they always did now, settling into their places at the table with the comfortable ease of people who had discovered they liked having a place. Walter first, then Sam, then Pete and Dutch together, then Cord. Cord looked like a man who had not slept. There were shadows under his eyes and a tightness in the skin around his jaw that Martha read immediately. She also read the way he watched Elias come into the room, that quick, anxious sweep, checking for something, measuring the temperature. He was checking to see if he had been found out. Martha put a plate in front of him, the same as everyone else. Biscuits, eggs, salt pork. She refilled his coffee without being asked. She said good morning to him the way she said good morning to everyone. Cord looked at her with something in his eyes that she couldn't entirely name, not gratitude, not guilt, something more complicated than either. Elias sat at the head of the table and said to the room, "Good morning. Lot to get done today. Walter, I need you on the east fence after breakfast. Take Pete with you." Walter nodded. Pete nodded. "Sam, I want you in the root cellar. Martha's found some things in there that need organizing." Sam looked up, mildly surprised at the specific assignment, but not suspicious. "Dutch," Elias said, "ride the north line and tell me what shape it's in." "Sure," Dutch said. "Cord." Elias said the name the same way he said all the others, exactly the same. Martha was watching, and she could not detect a single variation. "I need you to ride into town today. Pick up the order at the general store. Gerald Potts said it'd be ready by yesterday." Cord went very still for 1 second. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Take your time," Elias said. "No rush." The meal continued. Martha breathed. After the men had gone, after the bunkhouse had emptied out, and the yard had filled with the sounds of a working morning, Elias came back into the kitchen and closed the door behind him. He sat down at the table and he let his face do what it had been refusing to do for the last hour. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something more like grief, the specific grief of a man who has discovered that someone he trusted was not what he believed. "You sent him to town," Martha said. "I needed him off this property," Elias said. "And I needed to know if he'd go without arguing, which he did. Which tells me he thinks he's gotten away with it." "He thinks we're still in the dark," Martha said. "Yes." Elias put his hands flat on the table. "Now, tell me what we do." Martha sat down across from him. "What Cord told Whitaker last night changes the situation," she said. "Whitaker knows we've been to a lawyer. He knows we have the documents. He knows we're not going to fold." She paused. "That means his legal strategy is done. He knows that now, which means he's going to move to something else." "The Kellerman barn," Elias said. The name sat between them like a stone. "Possibly," Martha said. "Or something designed to look like an accident that isn't a barn fire. He might try to dispute the water rights directly, file something at the county level that creates enough uncertainty to tie us up legally while he does something else on the ground." She stopped. "Or he might just come here." Elias looked at her. "Come here. In person," Martha said. "To make you an offer you're supposed to feel you can't refuse. Men like Whitaker like to do that in person. They like to watch the other person's face when they name the number. And if I say no, then we find out what kind of man he really is," Martha said. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Henry should be here for that." "Henry should," Martha agreed. And Walter. Walter's the kind of man whose presence in a room changes what other men think they can get away with. A corner of Elias's mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. You've figured all of them out, haven't you? My men. I've been paying attention, Martha said. What about me? He said. He said it differently from how he said most things, less controlled, more direct, like it had gotten out before he could properly manage it. Martha looked at him steadily. You're the kind of man who builds things he loves and then doesn't know how to protect them when the building gets hard. Not because you can't, because losing something you love teaches you that loving things is dangerous, and the simplest way to stop losing things is to stop letting yourself have them. The kitchen was very quiet. Elias stared at her. That is, he said slowly, the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in 3 years. I know, Martha said. He held her gaze. Something in him was doing the thing it had been doing for weeks, that gradual, reluctant opening like a door that has been nailed shut, being worked loose one nail at a time. She could see it, and she had been seeing it, and she had not said anything about it, because it was not the time, and because some things had to happen at their own pace, regardless of the circumstances pressing in from all sides. Martha, he said. Elias, she said. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the table, looked back at her. After this is over, he said. When this is resolved, I want to talk to you about something. All right, she said. He nodded. He stood up. He was already pulling the controlled face back on. She could see it happening, but underneath it, something had been said that could not be unsaid, and they both knew it. I'm going to ride the property, he said. The full boundary. I want to know every inch of it before Whitaker makes his next move. Take your rifle, Martha said. He paused at the door. Already planned on it, he said, and went. Martha sat at the table for a moment after he left. Just a moment. Then she stood up and went back to work, because work was the one reliable thing in a world of unreliable things, and there was too much of it waiting to allow her the luxury of sitting still. She spent the morning doing 3 things simultaneously the way she had learned to do when a situation required more than one kind of attention. She organized the root cellar with Sam, who turned out under the performance of adolescent indifference to be an exceptionally observant and efficient worker, once given a task with clear parameters, while also listening to every sound the yard made, every horse, every voice, every change in the rhythm of the morning. And she was thinking, continuously, about Whitaker and Cord and what came next, and how to be ready for it. It was Sam of all people who gave her the next piece. They were working through the back of the root cellar, moving old crocks and assessing what was still good and what needed to go, when Sam said, without looking up from the shelf he was clearing, You know Cord used to work for somebody else before he came here. Martha went still. I didn't know that, she said, her voice even. Yeah. Sam moved a crock to the other side. He came from a ranch out near Douglas. Some land dispute happened and the place got sold off. He showed up here about 3 years back. Douglas, where the Kellerman place was, where the barn had burned. Martha kept her hands moving. You know who owned the ranch he came from? Sam thought about it. Hargrove, maybe? Something like that. I don't really remember. He mentioned it once and then never again. Hargrove, the same name on the survey request notice. The man Whitaker had bought out. Martha moved a jar of preserved tomatoes to the good shelf and did not allow her face to change. Thank you, Sam, she said. You're doing good work. Sam looked pleased in the way young men look pleased when given genuine credit, slightly surprised and trying not to show it. Martha excused herself from the root cellar 10 minutes later and went to find Henry Davis. She found him mending tack in the barn, which was where Henry went when he needed to think she had noticed. She told him about Sam, about Hargrove, about the connection between Cord's previous employer and the land adjacent to Broken Willow's eastern boundary. Henry listened with his hands still and his eyes focused on something just past her left shoulder, which was how he processed information. So Cord's been working for Whitaker's interests since before he got here, Henry said. That's what it looks like, Martha said. 3 years, Henry said. 3 years watching this place fall apart and reporting back. Waiting for it to get weak enough, Martha said. Henry set down the piece of tack he had been holding. He looked at Martha directly, which Henry Davis did not do casually. When Henry looked at you directly, you understood that it meant something. What do you need me to do? He said. Elias is riding the boundary, Martha said. He doesn't know what I just found out. I need you to find him and ride with him and tell him. She paused. He needs to hear it from someone who's been here the whole time, not just from me. Henry stood up. I'll saddle up now. Henry, he stopped. He's going to want to come back here and deal with Cord immediately. Don't let him, not yet. Henry looked at her. You still want Cord in place. Cord in place is information, Martha said. Cord confronted is just a man with nothing left to lose who knows everything about this property. She held Henry's gaze. Tell Elias I need 1 more day. Henry picked up his hat. 1 more day, he said. I'll hold him to it. He rode out. Martha went back to the kitchen and started on lunch, and while she worked, she thought about the architecture of what was coming, and how to make sure that when it arrived, they were standing in the right place to meet it. Cord came back from town at 2 in the afternoon. He came into the kitchen to drop off the supplies the way he always did, and Martha was at the stove, and she said thank you. And he set the boxes on the table and started to leave, and she said without turning around, Cord. He stopped. Sit down for a minute, she said. I'll get you some coffee. You look tired. A pause so thin it was almost not there at all. Then the sound of a chair being pulled back. She poured 2 cups and sat down across from him. She set his cup in front of him, the way she always set cups in front of people with care, without ceremony. She looked at him. He was looking at the cup. You've been here 3 years, she said. Yes, ma'am. That's a long time to be somewhere, she said. You get attached to a place whether you mean to or not. Cord said nothing. I think, Martha said carefully, that sometimes people end up in situations they didn't fully see coming. They make a choice that seemed straightforward, and it gets complicated, and then it gets more complicated, and by the time they see what they're really in the middle of, it's hard to see the way out. Cord's hands around his coffee cup tightened. He said nothing. I'm not asking you anything, Martha said. I'm just saying, if a person in a situation like that wanted a way out, wanted to be on the right side of something before it was too late, that's a choice that's still available, right up until it isn't anymore. She stood up. She picked up her cup. Drink your coffee, she said. Supper's at 6. She went back to the stove. Behind her, Cord sat at the table for a long time. He didn't say anything, but he didn't leave either. Elias and Henry came back in the late afternoon, and Martha watched from the kitchen window as they rode in together and dismounted, and Elias stood in the yard for a moment with his hat in his hand and his head slightly down, the posture of a man processing something difficult. Then he put his hat back on and came inside. He went directly to his study. Martha let him go. An hour later, he came to the kitchen doorway. Henry told me, he said. I know. 3 years, he said. The words came out roughly like they had to get past something solid. 3 years I trusted him. I gave him work when he needed it. I thought, Elias, Martha said. He stopped. It's not a reflection of you, she said. Men like Whitaker don't recruit the easy targets. They find the ones with something to protect, something they need. Cord had something he needed, and Whitaker used it. She paused. That's on Whitaker, not on you for trusting. His jaw was tight. It feels on me. I know, she said. It would feel on me too. But you can feel that after. Right now, I need you present. He looked at her. The rawness of him in that moment was not weakness. She was clear on that. She had been clear on that from early on. It was the rawness of a man who had been through enough that his surface had worn through in places, and what showed underneath was real. Whitaker's coming, he said. I could feel it when I was riding the boundary today. It's like I don't know how to describe it. like something about to break. "I think so too," Martha said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Maybe tonight," she said. "Maybe tomorrow, but soon." He nodded. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at the kitchen, at the stove, at the work table, at her grandmother's recipe book sitting on the shelf where she had put it the first week, and it had stayed. "You know what I know today," he said, riding the boundary. His voice had changed, quieter, like he was telling her something he had been working up to. "What?" she said. "Every place Clara loved on this land," he said. "Every place she had a name for a story about, I was riding past all of it. The place by the eastern creek where she used to sit in the mornings. The cottonwood stand where we buried her dog. The rise on the north side where you can see 3 counties on a clear day. And she used to say that was her favorite place in the world." He paused. "I haven't been to any of those places since she passed. I've been riding this land every day for 3 years, and I've been riding around them." Martha was very still. "Today I rode through all of them," he said. "On purpose. I don't know why today. Maybe because—" He stopped, looked at Martha directly. "Maybe because lately I've been feeling like I'm allowed to still be here. Like it's all right that I'm still in the world." He stopped again. "You did that. I don't know how, but you did." Martha set down the spoon she was holding. She turned to face him fully. "Elias," she said. "I know," he said quickly. "I know the timing is everything's about to happen, and this isn't the right—" "Elias?" she said again, quieter. He stopped. "When this is over," she said, "I'll be here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled long and slow, the kind of breath a person lets out when they have been holding it for longer than they realized. "All right," he said. "All right." He pushed off the doorframe. "I'm going to talk to the men tonight. Tell them what's really happening. All of it." He paused. "They deserve to know." "Yes," Martha said. "They do." "You should be there," he said. "When I tell them." "I'll be there," she said. After supper, which Martha made deliberately simple that night, not because the situation didn't deserve more, but because simplicity had its own gravity, its own way of telling people that what was coming required them to be present and not distracted. Elias stood at the head of the table and told his men the truth. All of it. Whitaker, the documents, Henry's trip to Cheyenne, the legal response, the barn in Douglas, and Cord. He said Cord's name last. The table went so quiet that Martha could hear the fire in the stove. Sam looked at Cord. Walter looked at the table. Dutch's face did the thing it did when he had already known something and was confirming it. Pete looked at his hands. Cord sat very still. He was not looking at anyone. Elias said, "I'm not going to ask you to leave tonight. I'm going to ask you one question, and I want an honest answer. Whatever happens after that happens." He looked at Cord directly. "Did you ride to Whitaker's men last night?" The silence was total. Cord looked up from the table. He looked at Elias. He looked briefly at Martha. She held his gaze without expression. "Yes," Cord said. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. "What did you tell them?" Elias said. Cord closed his eyes for 1 second. "Opened them. That you'd been to a lawyer. That you had the deed documents. That you weren't going to sell. Anything else?" "No." Cord's voice was flat and stripped of everything except what was true. "That's all I told him." "How long?" Walter said. He said it quietly without anger, which was somehow worse than anger. Cord didn't answer immediately. "How long, Cord?" Walter said again. "Since before I came here," Cord said. "Whitaker paid off the debts I had from the Hargrove place. In exchange for—" He stopped. "In exchange for keeping him informed." "He owned you," Dutch said. It was not a question. Cord flinched. "I needed the money." "We all needed things," Sam said, and his voice was the voice of a 17-year-old who had just grown up a little faster than he'd planned. The room was silent again. Then Martha said to Cord, When I talked to you this afternoon, about choices. Cord looked at her. Did you hear what I was saying? She asked. A pause. Yes, ma'am. Then you know there's still a choice in front of you, she said. Cord looked at Elias. I'm sorry, he said. It came out rough, like it had come a long way to get there. I know it doesn't fix it. Elias was quiet for the long moment. Long enough that Martha could see the other men measuring it, reading it. No, Elias said finally. It doesn't fix it, but it's a start. He paused. I need to know, does Whitaker know about the full content of the documents? Does he know what the water rights filing actually says? No, Cord said. I didn't know that myself until Henry told us at supper. He stopped. I didn't ride out last night to help him. I rode out to tell him it was over, that there wasn't anything more I could give him that was worth giving. The silence that followed was a different quality from the one before. Martha watched the faces around the table. Walter's head came up slightly. Dutch's expression shifted in a way that was subtle and significant. Sam looked at Cord with something that was not forgiveness yet, but was something prior to it, something that opened in the direction of it. Henry said from his end of the table, You told Whitaker you were done. Yes, Cord said. How'd he take that? Cord looked at Henry. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just looked at me like... He stopped. Like it didn't matter. Like whatever I did or didn't do, he was going to get what he wanted regardless. That landed in the room and stayed there. He's coming, Elias said. Not a question. He's coming, Cord confirmed. He said he'd be at Broken Willow before the end of the week to settle the matter personally. His words. Martha looked at Elias. Elias looked at Martha. Then we have tonight and tomorrow to be ready, she said. Walter put his hands on the table. Then let's get ready, he said with the straightforward authority of a man who has decided the time for discussing the problem is over. What do we need? What followed was not a war council exactly. It was something more domestic than that, and more serious. 6 men and 1 woman sitting at a kitchen table in the Wyoming night, planning how to protect something they had all in their different ways and different times come to love. Martha talked, and the men listened, which was not a thing that had always come easily to any of them, but had become over weeks of meals and mornings the natural order of that table. She laid it out clearly. When Whitaker came, he would come with legal papers, and probably with at least 1 armed man, and possibly more. He would make an offer and frame it as the last reasonable option before things became unreasonable. He would be looking for weakness, for hesitation, for division, for a man who could be separated from the people around him and made to feel alone. We don't give him any of that, she said. We stand together, all of us, including Cord if he's willing. Cord looked at her. Are you willing? She said. He looked around the table, at the faces of the men he had been lying to for 3 years, at the kitchen that had become, in spite of everything, the place he came home to. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'm willing. Walter nodded once. Pete exhaled. Sam looked at the table. Dutch, whose assessments were infrequent and therefore carried weight, said good. They talked until late. Martha made coffee and kept it coming, and the lamp in the kitchen burned on past midnight, and at some point Sam fell asleep, sitting up, and nobody woke him. It was past 1 in the morning when Elias walked Martha to the bottom of the stairs. The house was quiet. The other men having finally gone to their bunks, the kitchen lamp turned down low. You should sleep, Elias said. I will, she said. Martha. He said her name the way he had been saying it more often lately, with a weight to it that the formality of the first week hadn't carried. She looked at him. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, I want you to know this ranch is what it is right now because of you. The men, the garden, the all of it. He stopped. I lost the thread of this place when Clara died. You found it. I don't know how, but you did. Martha looked at him for a long moment. In the low light of the hallway of the house she had been living in for weeks and had come to know the sounds and rhythms of the way. You know something you've allowed yourself to call home. She looked at this man who had stood in a doorway the first day, and looked at her with tired eyes, and had not she understood, now seen her at all. He saw her now. She was sure of that. "Get some sleep, Elias," she said. "Tomorrow comes early." She went upstairs. She did not sleep right away. She lay in the dark and listened to Broken Willow breathe around her, and thought about all the things she had not expected to find here. She had come because there was nowhere else that would have her. She had stayed because there was work to do. And somewhere between the bones in the pantry, and the seeds in the apron pocket, and the documents in Clara's drawer, and the lamp burning late over plans that mattered, she had stopped being someone who was here because she had nowhere else to be, and had become something else entirely. She had become necessary, not useful, not tolerated, not the woman who could be sent away when the job was done. Necessary. She turned on her side and looked at the thin line of starlight along the edge of the curtain, and she thought about Whitaker coming, and she thought about what she was going to say when he looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her, and she was not afraid of any of it. She was ready. That was the last thing she thought before she slept. "I am ready." And the ranch breathed on around her steady and sure, like something that had made the same decision. Whitaker came on a Thursday. Martha knew it before she saw him. She was in the kitchen at 8:30 when she heard the horses, not one, not two, but several coming up the main approach at a deliberate pace, the pace of men who want to be heard coming because they want the people inside to have time to feel afraid before they arrive. She dried her hands on her apron and walked to the front of the house. Elias was already on the porch. He had been up since 4, which she knew because she had been up since 4, and had heard him moving in his study below her room, pacing the way he did when his mind was working through something it hadn't finished yet. He was standing at the porch railing now with his arms at his sides and his hat on, and his rifle leaning against the post beside him, not in his hands, but present. That was deliberate. She had told him last night to keep it present, but not to hold it, because holding it was a statement that invited a certain kind of response, and leaning it against a post was a different statement entirely. One that said calmly and without drama that this was a man who had options, and had chosen for the moment not to exercise them. Behind Elias on the porch and in the yard were the rest of his men. Walter stood to Elias's right arms, crossed the gray at his temples, catching the morning light. Henry was just off the porch steps, steady as a fence post. Pete and Dutch had come around from the barn when they heard the horses and had positioned themselves without being told on either side of the gate. Sam stood near the water trough, with his hands loose at his sides, trying to look older than 17 and nearly managing it. Cord was there too. He stood at the far edge of the porch, not next to Elias, not separate from the group, in the place of a man who has chosen a side and knows he is still earning the right to stand there. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the approaching riders. Martha came out of the house and stood on the porch. Elias glanced at her. She gave him a single small nod. He looked back at the gate. Charles Whitaker rode in first. He was not what Martha had built in her mind, and he was exactly what she had built in her mind. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-set in the manner of a man who had eaten well for a long time, with a wide face and small pale eyes that moved over the assembled group with the practiced assessment of someone who had done this before and expected it to go the way it always went. He was dressed well, not extravagantly, but expensively, the kind of clothes that said money without shouting it. Behind him came 2 men, not cowboys. The kind of men who ride for hire and let their posture say what their employer doesn't want to say directly. And behind them, to Martha's surprise, came Reginald Cross, the compact man who had ridden out 2 weeks ago with his envelope of legal language. He was carrying a leather satchel and wearing the expression of a man who has been told this will be straightforward. Whitaker pulled up at the gate. He looked at the porch. He looked at the men in the yard. He looked at Elias. And then he looked at Martha. He looked at her the way she had expected him to look at her, that dismissive categorizing sweep that men like him used to establish hierarchy before anyone had said a word. His eyes moved over her and moved on, and the moving on was the message she was not a factor. She was furniture. Martha looked back at him, and did not change her expression. "Carter," Whitaker said. He had a voice like a man who was used to rooms adjusting themselves to his presence. "I appreciate you coming out to meet me. This is my property," Elias said. "I'm not meeting you. You're on my land." Whitaker smiled. It was the smile of a man who has heard pushback before and treats it as a stage in a process rather than an answer. "Fair enough. I'll get to the point. I think we both know where things stand legally. I've had my attorney." He gestured to Cross. "Review the situation thoroughly. The water rights question is more complicated than your Cheyenne lawyer may have told you. I'm prepared to offer you a settlement that is more than fair given the uncertainty." "There's no uncertainty," Elias said. Whitaker's smile didn't change. "Son, there's always uncertainty when lawyers are involved. That's what they're for." "My deed is clean," Elias said. "My survey documents are filed and valid. My water rights have been in place since 1872. Mr. Aldrich in Cheyenne has already communicated that to your attorney in writing." Cross behind Whitaker shifted his weight slightly. Whitaker looked at Elias for a moment. Then he looked at Martha again, and this time the look was not dismissive. This time, it was assessing. She could see him recalculating, putting pieces together. The documents, the lawyer, the organized yard, the men positioned the way they were positioned. "You had help," he said. Not to Elias, to Martha. "Yes," Martha said. "He did." Whitaker looked at her with that pale-eyed steadiness. "And who are you exactly?" "Martha Whitmore," she said. "I'm the cook." Something moved across Whitaker's face. He was too controlled to let it fully form, but she saw its shape, contempt mixed with a recalibration he didn't want to have to make. "The cook," he repeated. "That's right," she said. "Now, Mr. Whitaker, I've read your attorney's letter thoroughly. I found it interesting that it relies almost entirely on the territorial clause for water rights, rather than the state filing, which would suggest that whoever drafted it either doesn't know that Wyoming's recent statehood changes the applicable law entirely, or does know, and is hoping you don't." She paused. "Which is it?" Complete silence. Cross looked at Martha with the expression of a man who has been caught and is determining how to be caught gracefully. Whitaker looked at Martha for a long, still moment. "The cook," he said again, slowly, differently. "The cook," Martha said. "Would you like coffee while we finish this conversation, or would you prefer to go ahead and get back on your horse?" Someone behind her made a sound that might have been Walter Brooks suppressing something. Whitaker looked at Elias. "You let your hired help speak for you." "Martha speaks for herself," Elias said. "I speak for myself. And what I'm saying to you is the same thing I said through my attorney. This ranch is not for sale. Not at any price. Not under any legal pressure you can manufacture. And not because of anything else you might be thinking about trying." The last sentence landed differently from the others. It had a specific weight that was not about legal documents. Whitaker heard it. "I don't know what you're implying." "The Kellerman place," Henry Davis said from his position at the foot of the porch steps. He said it quietly, the way Henry said everything without drama, with complete authority. "Out near Douglas. Their barn." The silence that followed was a different quality. Whitaker's face did not change, but something behind his eyes went very careful in a way that was its own answer. "I don't know what you're talking about," Whitaker said. "Yes, you do," Dutch said from the gate. Dutch, who said almost nothing, who assessed everything. He said just those 3 words, and they were sufficient. Whitaker looked around the assembled yard, looked at the men who were not hostile, not aggressive, not making threats, just standing, present, together. Looking at him with the specific clarity of people who have nothing to be ashamed of and know it. He looked at Cord. Cord held his gaze without looking away. Something passed through Whitaker's face then. It was not defeat, not yet, but it was the first moment of genuine calculation Martha had seen from him, the moment when a man realizes the situation is not what he walked into expecting. He looked at Cross. Cross gave a very small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Whitaker looked back at Elias. I have legal options remaining, he said. His voice had lost something. Not its confidence exactly, but its ease. You may, Elias said. You're welcome to pursue them. My attorney in Cheyenne will respond to everything you file every time you file it for as long as you want to keep going. This ranch has its documents, has its deed, and has people willing to stand here every single time you show up. He paused. How long do you want to do this, Mr. Whitaker? The yard held its breath. Whitaker looked at the porch. He looked at the men. He looked one more time at Martha, and this time the look was none of the things it had been before. It was the look of a man making a genuine assessment of something he had underestimated, and the assessment was coming back against him, and he was too experienced not to recognize it. He looked back at Elias. I'll be in touch with my attorney, he said. He turned his horse. His 2 hired men turned their horses. Cross turned his, and as he did, he looked at Martha for just a moment, not with hostility, not with respect exactly, but with the particular look of a professional who has encountered someone more skilled than anticipated and is making a note of it. They rode out. No one on the porch moved until the sound of the hoofbeats had faded entirely. Then Sam said, Is it over? The visit's over, Henry said. The fight might not be. He'll file something, Martha said. Probably within the month. Aldrich needs to be ready. Aldrich will be ready, Henry said. So will we, Walter said. Elias had not moved from his spot at the railing. He was looking out at the empty approach at the space where Whitaker had been, and his face was doing something complicated that Martha could see from where she stood behind him. She came to stand beside him at the railing, and they both looked out at the yard together. You told him you were the cook, Elias said. His voice was low enough that only she could hear it. I am the cook, Martha said. You demolished his legal strategy in 2 sentences. I also made biscuits this morning, she said. Both can be true. He turned to look at her then, and the face he turned was not the controlled one. It was the one underneath, open and real, and looking at her with something she recognized but had not let herself name until this moment, because naming things before they were ready to be named was how you lost them. She did not look away. Martha, he said. Elias, she said. I told you I wanted to talk to you when this was over, he said. You did. It's not entirely over, he said. There might be more legal. Elias, she said. He stopped. Say what you want to say, she said. He looked at her. The Wyoming morning was wide and blue above the ranch, and behind them the men had moved away with the natural discretion of people who understood when a moment was not theirs, and in the garden behind the house, the carrot tops were tall and green, and the beans were climbing their stakes, and somewhere in the barn the horses were moving in the comfortable way of animals who know the day has resolved in their favor. I don't want you to leave, Elias said. Not when the legal business is settled. Not when Whitaker gives up. Not for any reason I can think of, and I've spent considerable time trying to think of reasons because they'd be easier to deal with. He looked at her steadily. I want you to stay, at Broken Willow, with me. Not as the cook. Not as, you can cook if you want. Nobody's going to tell you not to cook. Martha felt the thing in her chest, that she had been managing carefully for weeks, come loose all at once, and it did not hurt the way she had expected it to. It felt like a window being opened. Elias, she said. He stopped talking. Yes, she said. He stared at her. Yes, he said. Yes, she said. I'll stay. He looked at her for a long moment, and then something happened to his face that she had never seen from him. Not the small, crooked, gone-before-you-could-catch-it smile from the kitchen weeks ago, but a real smile, wide and unguarded and true. The smile of a man who has been holding something in for so long that letting it go feels like the first full breath after years of breathing shallow. All right, he said. He said it the way you say something when what you mean is far larger than the words can hold. All right. Behind them, from the direction of the barn, Walter Brooks said to Sam Miller, at a volume he clearly intended to be private and wasn't, "Pay me back before supper." And Sam said, I didn't actually think she'd say yes this fast. And Dutch, passing by, said, I knew since the biscuits, and kept walking. Martha turned around to look at them, and every single man who met her eyes found something suddenly urgent to look at instead. And she stood on the porch of Broken Willow Ranch and felt something she could not entirely hold. It was too large and too long awaited, and too much like the thing she had stopped letting herself want, and she let it be that. She let it be too large. She had spent 27 years making herself small enough to fit in spaces that didn't want her, and she was done with that. She had been done with it since she walked into this kitchen and put her hands on that pot, and there was no reason to make herself small now, here in the place that had been the first to make room for her as she actually was. She went back inside, and she stood in her kitchen. It was hers. It had been hers since the first night she understood that now, and she put the coffee on, and she let herself feel it, the whole weight of it, the weeks of work, and the fear she hadn't admitted, and the loneliness she had carried so long. It had started to feel like a feature of herself, rather than a condition she was living in. She felt it, and she didn't push it down, and she didn't manage it away. And when her eyes got warm, she let them be warm, because she was alone in the kitchen for exactly 2 minutes before Elias came in and sat down at the table, and she poured him his coffee, and he said thank you, and she sat down across from him, and they looked at each other across the table, where everyone gathered, and where things got said, and where the ranch breathed. We should write to Aldrich today, she said. Today, he agreed. And the eastern fence needs real work before fall. Walter's good, but he needs more hands. I'll hire 2 more men, Elias said, before the month's out. The root cellar needs a new shelf on the left side. The bottom one is rotting. I'll build it this weekend. And the garden. Martha, he said. She looked at him. We have time, he said. We have all the time. She held his gaze. The kitchen was warm around them, and the coffee was good, and through the window she could see the garden with its green growing rows of things that had been planted from seeds that everyone else had given up on. And she thought about her grandmother saying, nothing is useless unless you decide it is. And she thought about bones in a bowl and wilted vegetables, and what becomes possible when you refuse to throw things away before you understand what they're worth. Yes, she said, we do. In the weeks and months that followed, Whitaker filed one legal challenge with the county office, which Aldrich responded to within a week, with documentation that caused the challenge to be dismissed before it reached any hearing. He filed nothing after that. Whether it was the documentation, or Aldrich's letter, or the assembled yard of people who had not moved when he expected them to, or something else entirely, Martha didn't know and didn't spend much time wondering. What mattered was what happened at Broken Willow, after not what didn't happen in a courthouse. What happened was this. Walter Brooks rebuilt the eastern fence from the ground up with Sam Miller working beside him every day. And when it was done, it was the kind of fence that said to anyone who looked at it that this property was tended by people who intended to be here for a long time. Pete and Dutch hired on for another year without needing to be asked. 2 new men came in October. Young brothers named Marcus and Cal, from a family that had lost their own ranch the previous spring, and they arrived uncertain and hungry, and Martha fed them the same way she had fed everyone with care without ceremony, with food that tasted like someone had meant it. And within a week they had stopped looking like men between places and started looking like men who had found one. Cord stayed. That was not a foregone conclusion, and Martha hadn't assumed it would be. But Cord had made his choice on the porch the day Whitaker came, and he made it again in the smaller ways that followed the extra hours on the fence, the deference to Elias that was not servile but was genuine. The way he looked at Martha sometimes across the supper table with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite guilt, but held both of them in some form she thought he was still working out. She did not make it easy for him, and she did not make it hard. She made him the same food she made everyone else, and she let him work his way back to whatever he was going to be able to live with. Clara's garden produced more than Martha had hoped for by August. The carrots came in thick and sweet, the beans climbed their stakes and gave 3 good harvests, and the mystery seeds from the back of the cellar, the ones in the unlabeled envelope she had tucked in her apron pocket. The first week turned out to be a variety of winter squash that produced 5 large squashes per plant in a deep orange that Sam called the best color he'd ever seen on a vegetable. Martha made a soup from them in October that made Walter Brooks set down his spoon mid-meal and say to Elias with complete seriousness, "Wherever she came from, don't let her go back." "She's not going anywhere," Elias said, and he looked across the table at Martha when he said it, and Martha looked back at him, and that was that simple and public and true. There were harder days. The legal business with Whitaker, even resolved, left a tension in the territory that took time to settle. There were neighbors who had heard the story at various levels of accuracy and came out of curiosity more than friendship. And Martha dealt with each of them the same way she dealt with everything, with a meal, with attention, with the steady understanding that people came around when they were given reason to, and that trying to force the process made it slower. By Christmas, 2 neighboring ranch families had been to Broken Willow for supper and left talking about coming back. By spring, they did. Elias asked her to marry him on a Sunday morning in March. He did it in the kitchen, which was where he had done everything that mattered since she arrived, and he did it clumsily, the way a man asks who has not asked before and is doing the asking with everything he has, rather than with practiced words. He said he had been thinking about how to do this right, and he hadn't figured out how to do it right, and he had decided that was not a reason to wait any longer. Martha said yes before he finished the sentence. He looked startled. "Elias," she said, "I said I'd stay." "I know, but staying is staying," she said. "It means all of it." He looked at her. Then he laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes from low in the chest, the kind that can't be produced on demand and doesn't sound like anything except the actual thing. She had heard it before a few times in the months since Whitaker's visit, and each time it reached her somewhere she didn't have a name for. "All of it," he said. "All right." They were married in April in the yard of Broken Willow, with the men of the ranch as witnesses, and 2 neighboring families who had become in the way of things something closer to friends. The ceremony was simple, performed by a circuit preacher who came through every month and who said afterward, with the directness of a man who had seen many marriages begin, that he hadn't seen 2 people look at each other quite like that in a long time, and he thought it would hold. It held. What Martha had made at Broken Willow, what she had started with bones in a bowl and wilted greens and the stubborn refusal to throw things away, before she understood their worth, was not just a ranch that ran, and a kitchen that fed people, and a garden that grew. It was the particular kind of life that happens when you stop trying to fit inside the space. Other people have decided you deserve and build, instead, the space that fits the full size of who you are. She was a large woman. She had been told her whole life that this was a problem, a limitation, a thing to apologize for, or explain, or minimize. She was a large woman who had walked into a kitchen with nearly nothing in it and had fed 7 hungry people from what everyone else had thrown away. And she was a large woman who had read a fraudulent legal document and dismantled it in 2 sentences on a porch, while the man who sent it watched. And she was a large woman who had found the seeds in the back of the root cellar and put them in the ground and watched them become the best squash soup anyone at that table had ever tasted. Her size was not a problem. It was just part of her, the same as her grandmother's recipe book, and her ability to find what other people missed, and her absolute refusal to leave things to be wasted that still had something in them to give. On the 1-year anniversary of her arrival at Broken Willow, Elias walked into the kitchen in the morning and found her making the same stew she had made the first night, bones and salvaged vegetables and dried beans and the herbs that now grew fresh from the garden she had rebuilt from seed. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, the way he watched her sometimes, when he thought she didn't notice, which she always did. "That's what you made the first night," he said. "It is," she said. "Why?" She thought about it. She stirred the pot once slowly and thought about all the things she could say about her grandmother's lesson about seeds and salvage and worth, about what it meant to make something beautiful from what everyone else had given up on. What she said was, because that meal was when this place decided it wanted to live. He came into the kitchen and stood beside her at the stove, and she let him stand there. And outside, the Wyoming morning was wide and clear, and the garden had new growth coming up in the beds. And in the yard, she could hear the men starting their day with the ease of people who know exactly where they are and mean to stay there. And the ranch that had been falling apart was not falling anymore. It was standing, solid and real, and tended by people who had found each other in the way that people sometimes do not through any particular plan or design, but through the steady accumulation of meals and mornings and hard things faced together, and the growing, unshakable knowledge that some things once found are worth everything it takes to keep them. The woman everyone had overlooked had come to a place everyone had given up on, and she had fed it back to life one meal at a time, and she had stayed, and the staying was not the ending of the story. The staying was the beginning of everything that mattered. And Broken Willow Ranch stood beneath the wide Wyoming sky, fed and tended and alive, because Martha Whitmore had picked up the bones that everyone else threw away, and understood as she had always understood, as her grandmother had taught her, as every hard year of her life had confirmed that nothing worth having is ever truly past saving. You just have to be willing to stay long enough to find out.